Have you ever been out for like a fantastic meal and as you've left the restaurant, you're already thinking about, we got to book this again?
Mm.
That's the experience you really want people to have. If you've ever seen a movie and then got, I can't wait for the next one to come out. Like that is completely what you're trying to create here. So great content is absolutely the core of every podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Art of Selling Online Courses. We're here to share winning strategies and secret hacks from top performers in the online course industry. My name is John Ainsworth and today's guest is Charley Valher. Now, Charley's the founder of Valher Media, and Valher Media is a podcasting services company. They provide comprehensive podcasting services for all of your podcast needs. They help business owners create, grow, and profit from podcasting. And today, we're going to be covering how to use the podcast to promote your online course, how to figure out if a podcast is the right thing for you, how to build the audience, how to get them to convert. Now, this is actually an interview. This is a talk from a summit that we ran, where Charley came on and explained all of these ideas for in the summit, and we're actually sharing that now as a podcast interview. So thank you so much for your attention. I think it's a really great episode and you should get a lot out of this. Before we get into the talk, if you want to know how to 2 to 5 times your course revenue from improving your funnels and your email marketing, then we've got a free training for you at datadrivenmarketing.co/webinar. That's datadrivenmarketing.co/webinar. It's a fast-paced training. I share an overview of our whole system, how it works, case studies of people who've implemented it, how much money they made, how you can use it too. It's totally free. It gives you a really solid overview. You'll understand the fundamentals of how this whole thing works. And you can register for it at datadrivenmarketing.co/webinar. Now, let's get over to the interview with Charley. So Charley, welcome. Thanks very much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, John.
So there's a ton of stuff here. I've got a bunch of questions for you. But I just wondered if you could start off by giving everybody a little bit of introduction, a bit of background about yourself, like how you got into podcasting and how you started a business doing that.
So I guess my obsession, and we'll call it an obsession, with podcasting started when I actually had a job. This was like, going back more than 10 years ago now when I was actually in the workforce. I used to listen to podcasts to and from work every day. And then the whole ambition of that was this was actually something that benefited me immensely. So as I was driving to work as a plumber, I was listening to internet marketing and entrepreneurial podcasts. And this really, really helped me in many, many ways, like start developing skills and ideas and understanding of the internet itself. And that really never left me. It's something I've been obsessed with for a very long time. So first business I went into was I had an agency. I built and grew an agency that I went to go on and sell, which was a fantastic experience. Second business I had was developing a VA company in the Philippines, Outsourcing Angel, which I did with a really good friend of mine, Lynn Padetti. And then on the back of that, launched Valher Media. And I kind of wanted to combine my previous skill sets of one in marketing and then two with building teams and using outsourced teams, along with my beloved obsession of podcasting. And that kind of began the birth of Valher Media. So that's the short version of the last 10 years. That kind of leads us to how this all came to be, where it's just something that benefited me so immensely in my own life that it's something I wanted to do for other people. One thing I will mention though is that along the way, I actually started my own podcast. And where I really struggled, like technically I was so into it, like I could record. And as you mentioned, it's quite easy to get a YouTube tutorial on how to do it. But I had huge issues around actually getting people to listen to my show. I had huge issues on actually, like, once we got someone is like, how do you get them to buy your stuff? Like, how do we take them from the show into the business? And failed miserably. I had a crashed first podcast. And then that became the birthing place of my podcast today, the business of podcasting, where we go into the other side of it. Not so much, how to record and stuff, but very much into like, how do you grow it? How do you make great content? And then how do you monetize it?
Nice. That's awesome. I think that's going to be super helpful for a lot of the people on the summit here listening along, because it's kind of a hot topic, right? It's like, so people talk about podcasting. I've got a friend, Rob. He started a podcast. It's one of the top 10 podcasts, business podcasts in the UK. It's kind of grown his whole business. He talks about it. And it's like, okay, how do I get some of that? Should I be getting some of that? Is it still something that's available as an option? Is it too late now? There's all these kind of questions people have. So I kind of want to dig into that a little bit today. So can you just give an overview? Like, how would it work if someone started a podcast and it was really successful? How would that help them to grow their online course sales?
Well, I think you have to recognize the nature of podcasting. So let's pretend the average show is about 30 minutes long. So you've got to realize that if you're spending 30 minutes in someone's ear once a week, the depth of relationship you have with someone is very, very different than if they see a quote card or a social media post or even read a blog, because they're hearing your voice. It's very long. And I think they or feel you get to understand you on such a better level. And I'll give you an example. Whenever I connect with someone who listens to my show, they always say something like, "Oh, I feel like I know you."
Yeah.
And I think you're a marketer. Like, that's exactly what you want to hear. Like,
Yeah.
that's like perfect alignment.
Nice. That's interesting. Okay. So how does that then convert to the next stage? Like, what is it that someone's heard your voice, they feel like they know you, they've built up this huge amount of trust. How does it actually work then for somebody converting their audience into buying courses from them?
Let's back it up a step first, because I think there's some context to give to this. About 18 months ago, I noticed some really big moves happening in the podcast space. So I'll give you them now. So number one is that Spotify were acquiring every podcast business they could get their hands on. They were spending about $5 billion on acquiring podcast businesses. Just nuts. They bought Gimlet Media, a whole bunch of them. Two, Google got very excited about the idea of indexing podcasts and actually putting some effort into their own app. And then three is that Apple themselves had decided to notice everyone else paying attention, and they invested a huge amount in improving their own podcast platform, which is Apple Podcasts. When I saw these three were all taking shape, not once, not twice, but all three, I was like, there's some big things going on in podcasting to recognize there's something up at a big macro level. Like, this is going to be the big next wave. So when I got word of this was one of the things that inspired me to kind of go, okay, this thing's about to get really big. The next thing that kind of happened is that any new car, as it rolls out of the production line, is equipped to handle podcasts straight out of the gate instead of radio. And then to top it off, there was this night where I was actually in an Uber driving home, and I noticed that all the radio shows started to have their own podcast to go with them. They're actually driving people from radio to podcasting. So it's really common that you can actually listen to your favorite once was radio shows as podcasts now. So the reason I give everyone all this information, I tell people constantly, is like, now is the time for podcasting. This is like blogging 10 years ago. The supply and demand is just so out of weight that it really makes sense for a lot of people to be investing in podcasting as a marketing medium for their business, just because this is where the attention and exposure is much more common. I mean, my mom listens to podcasts now, like where it was 5 years ago. So as for like, the overall play of podcasting marketplace, it's very exciting. I think if you are someone that wants to build a tribe or audience, or potentially sell a lot of courses in this case, that podcasting stands to be an exceptional asset and medium for you to get involved in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a guy who was asking to work with us to build funnels for his online course. And we only take on people normally who've got a decent sized audience. And he had a good audience, but on his podcast. And I was like, I don't know if that's going to convert to sales. I've never done that before. I've never tried to get one to connect with the other. And so I was like, here's a couple of things for you to like try out. And if this works, then we can work together. So he ran a webinar and he promoted it on his podcast, and he got people coming onto it, and he made $50,000. And I was like, all right, this sounds good. We can work together. We had like, I don't know, I think it was that point he was at maybe 10,000 downloads a month, something like that. So good size, but nothing like, astronomical or anything like that. So that was really kind of made me think, okay, these two can definitely connect together. So it's actually a really interesting combination, those two, isn't it? Because if podcasting is really taking off and online course sales is really taking off, like I was just looking at the Google searches for online courses this year, and it's gone up, depending on what term you look at, between 100 and 300% in the last year. It's like the two of those combined, it seems like there's something there. Okay, what's the first step? If someone's heard about this and they're like, yeah, that's cool, I want to use a podcast to build my audience, I want to use that to sell more courses, what's the starting point? What should they do first?
I think stage one is really establishing a niche. So if you're someone that's made a course, undoubtedly there's a market that is best suited to that course. Might be suited to multiple niches, but I dare say one is kind of the primary of who will get the most value. So stage one is like identifying the niche. A huge mistake I made early in podcasting was just being way too broad. way too wide. I was trying to serve every business owner instead of just going, hey, let's just teach this little tiny component here. So step one is definitely niche. And I would do it purely on the idea, or two things, but really one, is who's going to get the most value out of my course? Like, who's the perfect person to do my course that can actually afford to buy
it? Okay, cool. So, all right. So someone defines exactly who their niche is, who their customer avatar is. And I would say that always for work with course sales is like, you've got to figure out who is your ideal customer, because otherwise, how do you write copy for them? How do you figure out what kind of marketing is going to work? So they've got the avatar figured out.
Like it is step one, but undoubtedly they've probably already done some of this. So this should be a copy and paste from another project, maybe when they were originally designing their course.
And do people need to niche down further for podcasting than they would do for other parts of their marketing? Like, is that, if let's say someone has already done this, like they've gone through a customer avatar process, they've written a customer avatar up, they know who their ideal person is. Is there anything that's different for podcasting versus other parts of marketing?
I think one of the things you really want to look at with podcasting is the best way to stand out is to be different. And there's a few ways to do that, one of which is niche, but the other is having truly unique content. So I kind of look at this and go, there's two lanes you can play with here. Okay. You can either specialize in a certain market, or you can specialize in the type of content for that market, or maybe a little bit of both, but that's really how you want to think about it. So if we want to use an example here, like let's take Facebook ads as an example here, right? You could be a specialist in doing Facebook ads for dentists. Mm-hmm. Or you could be a specialist in doing Facebook ads for e-commerce. So it's a completely different industry where it's like a product thing versus like a dentistry niche, or you can combine them. So you could be like lead ads for dentists. Mm-hmm. So in the world of like podcasting itself, what I say to people is the perfect content you really want to make if you're in courses is course content that pre-sells it. So rather than working from like, how do we make really cool stuff for our audience and things they want, I'd be more working from the idea, if I went and looked at my course map here and maybe there's 10 modules, I would be thinking of like, what's the perfect pre-content for this, where if someone listened to this podcast episode, they would actually be closer to buying my course. How can I give them a little pre-taste of all of these modules, or however your course is laid out, in a way that as people consume this, they're sitting there going, I really want to get this course. Like, this course sounds like it's perfect for me now. Nice. And I think that's a lot of the intention behind like what type of content and who it would be for and in that niche.
That is fascinating. That, you know what, that fits really nicely with, so for the perfect webinar system from Russell Brunson, he talks about make sure your content is super valuable, but it's all about setting people up and addressing what their objections are and kind of teaching them whatever they need to know in order that buying your product is the next obvious step. And then Mikhail Deer, who I know you know very well, gave a talk for the summit about this 5-phase approach. And anybody who's interested in this can go and watch that one as well. He was talking about the huge importance of making sure you line up all of the marketing that comes before with what you actually want people to get. And it sounds like podcasting is exactly the same philosophy. It's about, what is the action you want people to take? Right. Eventually I want you to buy one of these courses. Okay. What do you need to know before that in order that buying the course makes sense as the next step? Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. Except most podcasters don't do it that way. Like, if you just did what you said there, you would find that if you had a podcast, you would have tremendously more success with actually converting it into sales. So starting with the end in mind and working back, and you can bring this into a few things, like perfect with courses. But if you did a book and let's say there's 12 chapters, really you should have a podcast episode on each of those 12 chapters. And then every episode you release would sell the book. So same philosophy here in courses. Every module is a lead into wanting that. It's the behind the scenes content. It's the additives. It's things that stack the thing to be perfect purchase.
So you mentioned there about, one episode on each of those chapters of the book. How does that fit with, do you typically recommend to people to do like, a weekly podcast or a monthly podcast? Or like, I know some people have done like James Schramko did a podcast where he did 30 episodes and then that's it. And I still hear people talk about it now, but that's not the most common way of doing it. The normal way seems to be once a week, once a fortnight or something like that. How does that idea of those 12 fit in?
We got to address something here, right?
Okay.
So if Oprah did a podcast, she can do whatever she wants. You know, and Stramko kind of falls, and James is a dear friend, but he's got such brand power where he doesn't have to obey the rules.
Right.
And I think this is something that is a big issue in a lot of these things is like, if you've already got a big audience and you're already famous like Russell Brunson, you know, or so many other people these days, you can get away with a lot of things. You can do unusual things and still get reasonable results. Again, Oprah could do a podcast. She does one episode a month or a year, and it would still be wildly successful because she's got that brand power. But for us mere mortals, those that don't, there's things that kind of work a bit differently. So this is what I would say. For most people, and this is general rules, so at Valher Media, we manage over 1 million downloads a month. So we've got a lot of data to back this up. 1 to 2 podcast episodes a week is the sweet spot. Any less than that, and there's not enough frequency to build the relationship and value, so you want at least once a week. Any more than 2 though, and there's a diminishing return. So we kind of find that people struggle to keep up with more than that content because they do consume other shows. So 1 to 2 episodes a week is the sweet spot. The second part of that, podcast episode length, is you really want your episodes to be about 30 minutes. So we know from what we see in like drop-offs in our data that if someone has got a podcast after the 30-minute mark, there's a significant reduction in people that are making it past that point. And when you think about it, it makes sense because like most people, when they drive or go on a commute or whatever it is, that's about the length of a trip to and from work on average. So we can understand why that is. But what's kind of funny on this point is like some people will do these hour interviews and there's gold in the last 15 minutes, but so few people heard it. So we really want to encourage people that when you are making podcasts is like value stack it. That first 30 minutes has got to be absolute gold. You really don't want to waste your intros or, you know, how's your day questions? How's the family? What's the weather like? Oh my God, you're in a different part of the world and I'm in a different part of the world. Like everyone kind of knows that.
Okay, cool. So at this point, then someone's defined their avatar. They know how often they're going to be putting that podcast out. They know the idea is to set everybody up in order that once they've heard enough of your podcast episodes, they're going to think, I really need this course.
Yeah.
What's then the best way to select? Would you recommend doing guest podcast versus like a solo cast or whatever the right term would be, or like anything that you recommend in terms of how to think about the format for it?
Yeah, definitely. I've even got some things we've found as well. What I really like to see in podcasts is a mix between guest episodes and solo episodes. I think that is what we call at Valher Media the content mix. And the reason for that is a fewfold. One is that when you have guests on a podcast, while they can be a great additive, sometimes we can spend all our time making them look good rather than making ourselves look good. So if we only interview people and we don't ever shine within our own stuff, all we're going to do is sell other people's courses in this example instead of our own. So what I really love to see is a mix where you get to be a hero on your own episodes and talk about the things you want to talk about, where you get to make the points you want to make and you really control that content narrative to be perfect for leading people where you want them to go. And then in the guest episodes, you still want to cover those important topics, but there's much less pressure off to kind of shine and be the hero within an episode or dominate a guest or anything like that. So for most people, 50-50. If you're going to do 1 episode a week over a month, we want 2 guests and 2 solo. That's a really good starting point. And then, of course, you can build into other topics and things from there. So content mix, that's how I would address it.
And how does that idea, let's say we go back to that book with 12 different chapters, how does that fit in? Is it that all of those 12 things are like, these are potential topics we could cover and we'll talk about some of these topics with guests and we'll talk about some of these topics individually, but we'll only cover things that are in these 12 different topics?
Okay, so we'll go through an example here. Let's pretend you and me are going to write a book and it's on selling courses. How convenient. Okay, and part 1 of that first chapter is defining your audience as customer avatar, which we've covered here. I could do an episode on avatars with a guest and I could do one solo. So there could be 2 episodes covering that 1 chapter. Or I could do just one with a guest, or I could do just one on my own. What I think is important to recognize in podcasting is there's certainly a part art to it. It's not all hard science. You do have the opportunity to add some creativity. So if you've got a course with 12 modules, you could do a monthly theme and do each module as a theme for the month if you liked. Probably wouldn't do that. It might be a bit extreme, but it just kind of shows like where you can kind of take this. So there's no limits. I would be thinking about like, how can I, 1, create a really high value piece of content that leads into my course. And then 2, apart from that is like, who's the right person to bring on for that if it's a guest, rather than focusing on who's the most famous person I can bring on who might share this on social media.
Right.
So that would be some of the things I think about there.
Okay, that makes sense. What about building an audience? So that's obviously a crucial part of it. Is it about just creating great content, or is there other ways to grow your audience faster?
Yeah, great question on that one. So here's the thing, and I'll mention this first, is there's definitely ways to build an audience faster, but if you're bringing people into a terrible first impression, they won't stay. So your content has to be good before you attack this.
Okay.
Great content is you can't just make noise. People won't hang around for that. You really have to make noise and have something awesome for people to get value on, where they go, I got to come back. Have you ever been out for like a fantastic meal, and as you've left the restaurant, you're already thinking about, we got to book this again? That's the experience you really want people to have. Or if you've ever seen a movie and then got, I can't wait for the next one to come out. Like, that is completely what you're trying to create here. So great content is absolutely the core of every podcast. You can't not have it. You can't be awesome tactically at growing it and then not have the good stuff to keep them around. That being said, you definitely want to grow it. Like, that's a part of it as well. There's something you're at there. So we'll assume you've nailed your awesome content. Now it's time to think about, like, how do we grow a podcast? So once upon a time, if you go back maybe 5 years ago, you could literally just put it up on iTunes, do some selective keywords, maybe get some friends to leave a review, and you would start getting some traction. These days, it's kind of all gone. You really have to take the marketing of a podcast very seriously, just like you take marketing a course very seriously. So I start from, like, if we've got this customer avatar, where do these people hang out? And then the approach I see is most relevant in 2020 is content amplification. So I'll go into this a little bit. Let's pretend we're created a course on selling courses. Awesome. And we've got a podcast on selling courses. And I think, where are we going to actually like promote this to bring people in? I would very much look to probably Facebook ads and YouTube ads. And then I would very much use the podcast content as what we drive people to. So my whole intention is to use ads to drive people to the podcast, get people to consume the podcast, get to know, like, and trust me and feel like they know me, using that term from there. And then from there, I'm going to actually get people to buy the course itself. My view is that you can be far more successful in building the audience and selling to them multiple times, rather than just trying to direct market a course to them in that nature. And that might be my opinion. And obviously I'm biased because I love podcasting and that's the way I want to do it. But it's certainly what I see many of the clients at Valher Media doing.
Nice. Okay. When you say you're doing Facebook and YouTube ads, are you taking like clips from in the podcast that are the content of the ads?
Definitely. We'll cover creative quickly because I feel like that's a really good question.
Okay.
If you do a video podcast, I do a video podcast. Literally, we are taking like little clips and snippets from the podcast and using it as like bite-sized content to get people in. If you don't and you have an audio podcast, what we recommend is just pull out your iPhone and shoot a little selfie video selling someone on the idea of listening to the podcast. So we really don't like audiograms. They don't perform as well as video content. So we're very big on video ads. Now, if you're a podcaster, you shouldn't be camera shy as it is, or voice shy, like you're getting yourself out there enough. So to either record a video podcast or shoot a little video separate with an iPhone, if that's all you've got, would be what I use for my actual ad content to drive people to the podcast.
Okay, that's making sense. So as a heads up for everybody, we've also got in the summit, we have video interviews with Tom Breeze, who's talking about YouTube ads, and then Rita, my wife, and Bryce are both talking about Facebook ads and how to use those to drive traffic really well. So if you're interested in those ideas, you can go and watch those talks as well. Okay, so how do you then go to that next stage? You've identified your avatar, you've got great guests, you've got a great podcast, you're covering the right kind of topics, you're building up the audience using content amplification. People are trusting you. How do you then move that on to actually promoting the course? Is that about like I've heard some people who do like they're their own sponsor, like they do ad reads for their own thing, or do you drive people to an email list? Like, what's the next step in your opinion?
Oh, I like multiple of these. So number one, definitely your own sponsor, but tastefully be your own sponsor. I say this so importantly. Some people read their own ads they put themselves off. Like, it's funny, they read it and it's like, wow, you didn't enjoy that. It was so awkward and salesy. It's like, you don't want to buy your own stuff. I hear that.
Yeah.
So you got to be careful of that. So if it was me, I'd be saying something like, so again, I'd be saying, look, today's episode is actually based around module 1 of the course we sell here at Valher Media. It's all about your niche. Now, the reason we're making this episode is we want people to understand why niching is so important. So if you do enjoy this episode, make sure you head over to Valher Media and you can actually get the full course there. Otherwise, we're going to get into this episode and cover this one now. So that's the type of ad I would do, where it's an awareness ad. Like, someone knows, hey, there's a course to go along with this now. Not a hard pitch. It's just about planting that seed that if you want to do more here, that's how you do it. And I would do that at the very start of the episode where you have the most engagement. So if you're going to be your own sponsor, which I would heavily encourage, those types of tasteful placements are definitely the way I do it. I like soft call to actions, not abrasive. You have 10 minutes to buy this course. Yeah, I really don't like that type of stuff within podcasts. Other mediums it probably lends to a little bit, but that's part 1. Part 2 is that with all the stuff we do, if we're driving ads, we're also using their remarketing platforms. So if someone's shown interest and intent on Facebook ads or YouTube ads, which I'm sure your other guests have probably covered more in depth on those strategies, we love running remarketing ads from people that are engaging with the podcast to courses from there. So you can use remarketing platforms to take advantage of that. And then thirdly, along the way of building a podcast, undoubtedly you're going to build an email list. And you should build an email list. I think it's a huge mistake not to build an email list with your podcast. So one of the things we really love to do as well is when we're sending out emails to notify people new podcasts are out, we also occasionally will send them, if you've enjoyed the podcast, you'll probably get a lot of value out of this course. Maybe check it out here and have a look at it from that place. I would mention that podcasting is a bit more gentle than like direct response because it's a more delicate relationship. So you will find you'll do less high intensity call to actions and deadline funnels than you would in other mediums, but it's certainly a much higher impacted relationship where you can get more results because you know these people so well. Like, they take what you say seriously.
Okay, let's just dig into a couple of those then, because if someone's doing their own, you mentioned about tastefully doing the, being your own sponsor. Is that about like casually dropping it in throughout the episode? Is it about like having like Jake Jorgensen does a podcast called Working Without Pants, and he
great title.
He basically does an ad read. So he does it himself, but he says like, this week the podcast is sponsored by my business, Lead Cookie, and then he does like the ad read for it. Or the other way it seems to me that you could do it is say, kind of like what you just mentioned, but like not splitting it off separately and say, so we're going to be talking about, customer avatars today. And if you need to learn more about this, like we're going to cover a lot about it today. If you need to learn more about it, you want to get all the resources, then we have got a course, you can go and get this at such and such address, and then kind of carry on with the topic. And then later on, there might be something else that comes up about like, this is actually relevant to how do you record the podcast or what have you. We've also got we're going to talk about that a bit here, but we've also got a course if you want to learn more about it. Like, would you kind of drop it in like that? Or is it more like structured and something that just goes at the beginning or the end or what have you?
Yeah. So you're talking like the difference we call it is like planting seeds, where it's like you're seeding it into your content. And then there's the other version where it's like a segment where it's its own thing. It's like a TV ad. It's abrasive. I'm very much for a more native approach.
Okay.
I really like the seed plant in podcasting, because I think you've got this weird thing is like, as soon as someone says, oh, this episode's brought to you by, everyone inherently goes, this isn't what I was here for. Like, give me skip this, let's go to the thing. And if anyone listens to Joe Rogan, do they even listen to the first 10 minutes?
It's just like, skip. Yeah. back a bit. There we go. That's it.
It's kind of weird. It's like this relation. Like, personally, I'm not against ads. I like ads. Like, again, if there's something that can help me and it's in line with what I'm doing and ads is the way they're reaching me, I'm cool with it. Like, I have no issue. But as a globe and population, we don't like ads. So I very much feel that if you've got the opportunity to be native and seed things in and actually make your content relatable to the desire, you're going to have a far better result than being an abrasive sponsor or doing shout outs in that way. And I just think it's better content. Now, that's an opinion. I'm sure there's people out there getting results doing it a different way. But from what I've seen in my own experience and with the shows we do, seeded into the content will get you a far better result.
Okay. How then do you recommend building the email list? Like, for example, Amy Porterfield, I'd heard her podcast, and she has often got like a specific lead magnet that goes with that episode, something specific for you to go and download. Do you recommend having something like that? We've got one client who's got like you can go and download the transcript, or he's got like 4 different lead magnets, and he just kind of mentions occasionally whatever one seems most relevant. Like, any tips on how to connect those two things together?
Yeah, great question again. Well researched. What we really do, and I like this, if you've got the resources, you've got a big team and you can make like a super specific lead magnet for each episode, do it. It's awesome. James Schramko does it wildly with success, and a lot of people like Amy do it as well, where they're making like, again, we'll use this example of avatars, where it's like they'll do an episode on avatars, you can get a framework resource on avatars, and then there's probably a course down the line. Awesome in theory, but it's heavy on your team resource and cost to be doing that week on week if you're like a small publisher. So what I kind of say is that for most business owners, there's probably like 3 to 5 things that are evergreen in your space. To put them up on a resources page on your website and continually drive and be relevant to those overarching evergreen ones will probably serve you better. And I'll give you an example. I mentioned this earlier with my podcast, The Business of Podcasting. People really only care about growing their audience, making better content, and monetizing their audience. So I just continually make evergreen lead magnets that fill that need, and they can stay there and they will get downloaded. So if you're in the space where you're doing a podcast, there's probably 3 lead magnets you can make that would be the perfect segue into your course. Like, what are the frameworks or templates or something that's relatable in that way? Again, working from the end in mind, I'd put it on a /resources page on your website, and then I would start putting that and talking about it in your podcast episodes. And then over time, that will build and flow. So every week I'm putting out content with that link. People jump on my email list from that, which is fantastic. And of course, it also works really well because if you are driving ad traffic, so again, using that content amplification, you're kind of driving people to that as well, which is just a nice little added bonus.
Okay, so you could have some ads that are retargeting, that are driving people to the podcast episodes, some that are driving people to the course sales page, and some that are driving people to the lead magnet, and kind of mix those up, and whatever ones people respond to is what you know.
I'd be careful what I give away here. That's our exact retargeting strategy. No, but that's it. Like, it's so powerful. Is like, the way we kind of look at it, we spend half our money on retargeting and half on cold traffic. That's just how we portion it. It works for us. And we've got, just constant cold traffic going to podcasts, snippets to podcasts, videos to podcasts. We grow our audience in that. The other 50% is remarketing to people that have watched a podcast to the next podcast episode. They like one episode, maybe they'll like another. 2, as you said, is the resources. Like, get the framework to go with this stuff. And then 3 is to the sale point. And that mix has been really good for us. We've been quite a fan of that.
Nice. Okay. Do you ever, for yourself or for any of your clients, do you ever promote something like a webinar directly on the podcast?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I'll mention this from here is that I don't think a podcast introduction should ever be like a jingle that's locked in.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So how like sometimes you put on a podcast. I love it when it's like someone from the UK or an Aussie, and then it's just this really like American intro.
Yeah. Who is that guy who's doing all those intros with that weird voice?
A fortune out of this. Anyway, I really don't like that in general. And even if you are an American or it is your voice, I think you're missing a huge opportunity in just using the same jingle and ad, because it's like we just go banner blindness. We're not really listening. So what I say from here is that there's a huge opportunity in just like making an intro for every episode that is a little bit custom, tells people about the episode itself, but you can also promote things that are relevant to you at that time. So you can be really strategic where it's like, in the example here, we're using an example. We've got this course and we decided we've got a webinar that's how we're going to sell the course. So if we have a podcast, we could just drive our podcast traffic to that webinar. And then that's where we would make the actual sale or conversion if we wanted from there. So a really great way to do it. And instead of promoting resources, you just promote the webinar itself or put the webinar on that resources page as well, so people can get to it from there.
Makes sense. Okay. If you had a live webinar, how much do you find people listen to the podcast when it's just come out versus like going back through a backlog? Do people tend to just listen to like the most recent episodes? Can you tell that from your data?
Absolutely, you can. This is all what's in the hosts themselves. You can see what episodes are listened on certain days. Now, I'll give you something here is that my podcast comes out at 5 a.m. on a Tuesday, which is today for me. By 7:30 a.m. that morning, I normally have people messaging me telling me something about that podcast episode. So
Right.
people very much tend to be, once they're fans, is they're constantly listening to the latest episode, which is great, which is what you want. But undoubtedly, I have people find past episodes that are relevant to certain topics as well. So I think you have to act with a bit of an intention that maybe an evergreen webinar or an evergreen resource or something that can be kept live that doesn't take your continual upkeep is probably a really great solution. Or if you do a live webinar and you've done that from there, turn it to evergreen after. So anyone that's found it can get through it again. So I think it's something to be noteful of when you're creating content that stays relevant or might be viewed at a later date, is just putting a few strategic decisions in place where it can still be valuable.
Okay. And then one of the things with direct response marketing is that if you're doing let's say you've got an email going out, you want one call to action. You don't want to be promoting, like you could do this or you could do that or you could do the other. Is that the same in podcasting? Like you've mentioned about, we've got this different lead magnet that's on this topic and we might have a webinar that we promote here. Would you do okay, we're just going to have one thing per episode that we're mentioning? Or would you kind of drop things in whenever it happens to seem relevant to that point in the podcast?
When we think about it, I would say this is that podcasting is not direct response marketing. There is certainly elements of it, but it breaks many of the rules. So earlier in the episode, I mentioned I used to have a marketing agency, we were straight ads. Couldn't have been more direct response. I would almost, look at someone in disgust if they mentioned anything about branding. We live and we learn, all the rest of it from there. Podcasting is very relationship based from there. What I would say is it's really important to probably have more important things for your show than others, but really you want to be leading everyone to the same place. So I would say that, the objective we might have for a duration of time on a podcast might be course sales. So just selling one particular course. It doesn't matter if someone is jumping on the email list, getting a lead magnet, or just consuming the content. Everything brings them closer to that goal. So it is kind of aligned. It's just that it allows you to work multi-channel. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Like in my podcast itself, I have people that just buy things straight from hearing me on the episode. I'll talk about this. They contact me and they say, I want that. At other times, people listen and subscribe to the show for months before then buy from email, even though the podcast was the thing that actually got them interested in the first place. So I'm of the opinion you want to let people take their own path. Doesn't mean you can't have ways that they can progress. It's just with podcasting, you want to let them, simmer a little bit, work their way through it being the right thing.
Okay. What's some of the mistakes that people make with any of this, whether it's the growing the audience or the monetizing? Where do you see people going wrong?
How much time we got? No, I'll start with some big ones. So number one is people don't niche, right? So they might have a course on marketing and then they make a course for every business owner in the world, rather than bringing it in tighter. So get it in tight. Massively mistake number one. Mistake number two is they make the content they want to make instead of the content their audience wants from them. So we had a little joke before this, John, about the idea of it's often at times in marketing, it's about solving the problem they think they have, not the problem they actually have. So when it comes to making content, I've seen people where it's more about them being a celebrity and people experiencing them than actually helping their audience. I think it's like a reality TV show or something rather than actually helping people solve a problem or improve their lives. So I'd say you've got to put your audience really at the forefront of your content in serving them through this as well. 3 is just loose goals. They're not actually, they're trying to build an audience with no plan to monetize or what they actually want to get out of it. So we see that really commonly where it's I once met a person that had a show doing 100,000 downloads a month, but just nothing coming from it.
Oh.
And they were just trying to work. It's frustrating for them because to your point is I've met people with shows at less than 10,000 a month that it's like an ATM. It's unbelievable. It's the most passionate audience we've seen. So it's really curious on that one from there. The next thing I'll probably say from there is just not marketing the show is another one we see pretty commonly, where it's people just kind of share it on social media and they've got this attitude that it's good, people will find it. And it's no, they won't. Just they won't find your awesome course that you don't market. So you got to kind of work through some of those, but that would definitely be the common ones. Oh, and I'll give one more. Often a huge mistake is people do a podcast that is just guests and they just make their guests look good. They never share stories or their own opinion or anything throughout the episode itself so they can shine. I think that's a really
interesting. I listen sometimes to Dave Asprey's podcast, the Bulletproof Coffee guy, and it's hard sometimes for the guests to get a word, or Joe Rogan as well, right? That's sometimes hard for the guests to get a word in. It's like, just like, I know stuff about this too. Let me tell you all about it. And that's kind of maybe...
James Shremko does the best job of adding in stories and examples with his guests. Like he's got this thing where it's like he only has guests on, he does a few solo episodes, but majoritarily guest episodes. But it's like he does a really good job of when the guest answers, he adds things to it that make you, it's like, oh, it's kind of like a really good way to interview. So if you're looking for a good example, that's a really good one, I think, for like how to balance an interview where people still want to buy your stuff.
Nice. One of the things it seems to me from this is, I think for a lot of people, figuring out what order to do these things in seems like very important. So for example, you've got here, you do a podcast. This is how you make great content. This is how you build up the audience. This is how you get the word out in front of more people. And then you've got somewhere to point them to. If all you have at that point is you're pointing them to the lead magnet, but then there's no email marketing that's happening after that, then that kind of falls down. So it's really interesting kind of seeing how all of these things fit together. A lot of the people who we've had on the summit have been talking about, like, so for example, Tom Breeze, he was talking about YouTube ads. Here's how you make great YouTube ads. And I'm like, okay, it seems to me like you've got to have the funnel in place first before you would bother with any of this. And he's like, yeah. I was like, of course, if you haven't got the funnel, why would you be bother running ads to it? So it seems here it's kind of similar with the podcasting as well. It's like you can build up an audience, but you either need to build up the audience with the idea in mind that you're not going to make much money from it until you build the funnel, whether it's the webinar funnel or a tripwire funnel or whatever that sits behind the lead magnets. Do you see people doing it in one order versus the other? Like, do you see people who already have a funnel and already have a whole process that takes people through from getting on their email list to buying, then starting podcasting being generally better? Or do you see a lot of people who you're helping, like, they build a podcast audience and then they figure out the other part?
Oh, meaty question. So let's have a look at that. I kind of view it in a few ways. Like if you've already got a course, right, and you've made this great course, then it makes sense to design a podcast to sell that course, right? So working from the end in mind and then going back forward from there. Like that's how I would definitely do it. But in the reverse of things is if you haven't made the course yet and you want to build the podcast and your podcast is a tool for working out what this audience wants so you can create a killer course that they'll actually want to buy, well, that's not necessarily a wrong way either. You really have to address maybe where you're at. So if you're established, you can work from the back. And if you're not, you can work from the front. I don't think there's a wrong option. I just think you have to acknowledge the path looks slightly different. So you may spend more time experimenting in your first 12 months, working out, well, if I made a course, what would those topics be? When I release an episode of the podcast, like they go nuts. They want to know more about this. So it could be a really cool discovery tool if done right, or it could be detrimental and just becoming about monthly downloads and not really do any of that if done wrong. So I think you look into like, well, where am I at and which lane am I playing with from here? I've seen and been a part of success both ways. I don't think that one is necessarily better than the other. It just depends on like your situation to it. But to the point of Tom, and shout out to Tom, like Tom taught me YouTube ads. He's such a generous human in general. But exactly to that is like, I hope this is the theme of many people are realizing is like, there's no like one little trick to business success. Like you really have to have a lot of different pieces working and in place. Like that's how you get success. I mean, you can have a great podcast, but you got a shit course that no one goes through. Like it's not going to work. You got to have that cohesion there. If you can't email market, like all these pieces have to come together to kind of make this puzzle work.
Okay. Well, this has been awesome, Charlie. I really appreciate your input on this. Is there anything else that you feel like I've not asked about, but people should really be thinking about when they're trying to decide on this?
Oh, I mean, just remember I'm biased.
Yeah.
So as I said, just remember I'm a podcast guy. I'm just going to say this now. Do a podcast.
Is there anybody then who shouldn't? Any niches that shouldn't be, or any industries where it's less likely to work?
I generally say that if it's a topic that can have books, it's a topic that can have podcasts. Or if it's a topic that can have TV shows or movies, it's a topic that can have podcasts. There are some that I would think may not work too well. Like if you're maybe talking about the deeper sides of manufacturing, I don't know if there's a big enough audience, but I could be wrong. Like there's probably a lot of people that have to deal with that stuff where a podcast to be really helpful. What I would say is it's, and I love the Wayne Gretzky saying about, skating to where the puck is going, not to where it's been. And I tend to think that podcasting is in a really great trend right now. And if it is something you did want to get in front of, it's worth paying attention to. I would recommend, we touched on this lightly, but I think video podcasting is about to explode. I am seeing in this pandemic crisis time is like the desire to watch interviews and content has gone through the roof. So some of our shows that were predominantly audio are like 50% of their views are on video now. Like people are consuming differently and YouTube is just adding into this. So if I was someone that was starting today or had an existing podcast, I'd be very much looking towards video podcasting as the future of this industry. I think it's going to get huge.
And how does that work then? Is it just about upload it to YouTube, and then repeat the same things we talked about, content amplification, that kind of thing? Or is when you've got a video podcast, do you share that in other places besides YouTube?
What gives you so much more leverage? So this is what you said there is absolutely on point, is like, well, thank Joe Rogan for this, but there is a plethora of people out there who use YouTube as their podcasting app now, because that's how they watch the Joe Rogan podcast. So just like Joe uploads his, you can do the same thing and do the clips. And like, that's very much become a normal thing to do on YouTube. Strangely enough, people actually consume full episodes of my podcast on Facebook. Kid you not, we upload the hour video on Facebook. And people use that and they do consume that. It's not what I would do, but again, I'm not judging how people want to consume their media. That's up to them. So one of the things I would just like get people to recognize is if you've got an audio podcast, you can definitely be on iTunes and Spotify and all those things. But if you're doing video and audio, is you can be on every medium you want to be. And you can reach people uniquely that may not be reached by other people only doing audio, which is where the opportunity is.
Okay, that makes sense. You mentioned throughout this that you've got like a few different lead magnets on those different topics that people can sign up for from you. Where could they, what are those resources and where could they get hold of them?
So if you head over to Valher Media, so valhermedia.com/resources, we have all, as I mentioned in this episode, that page with all our evergreen resources are up. So the one I'd probably recommend for people here is the 11 pillars of a highly profitable podcast, where it's just got all the things you really need to have in place to have a really successful show.
Nice. So if you have enjoyed this interview and you found this helpful, you want to be able to watch it back again afterwards, you can get access to the All Access Pass, and it's got recording of this and recording of all of the interviews and all of the presentations from everybody in the summit. It's also got all different kinds of stuff that we've included. All different summit guests have included different resources. We've got maps of different kinds of funnels, a chance to win a free video testimonial, courses on creating webinars, swipe files, templates, the hiring SOP, Facebook ads, SOPs and training, free one-to-one sessions with the speakers and a ton more. And there's a link on this page for you to be able to get hold of that All Access Pass. So if that sounds helpful, then take advantage of that as fast as you can. I think the price will be going up a little bit later. Charlie, thanks so much for taking part in this. This has been really educational, fantastic. And I now want to go and start a podcast.
Oh, success. No, thank you for having me, John. It's been a pleasure.